Let's now shift our attention to the news developments in Belarus, which is currently undergoing a political turmoil. Tens of thousands of people are out on the streets every weekend demanding the resignation of President Alexander Lukashenko, and the authorities have cracked its whip on the protesters. On Tuesday, Belarusian President Lukashenko said that he has changed his approach in dealing with the protesters and threatened that he will track down every protester.
Плохо, что шатаются по Минску. Плохо, что ведут себя в наглую. Мы поменяли тактику. Мы в спокойном режиме найдем каждого. Современные средства позволяют это делать, что мы, кстати, и делаем. И каждый ответит за свои деяния. Я тут не угрожаю, мы в этом направлении работаем. И это дает определенный эффект.
It should be noted that the Lukashenko regime has already given a free hand to the police for using firearms against protesters. Lukashenko has been ruling the former Soviet nation since 1994, and he retained his seat after the August election with a massive 80% vote share. Since the election, regular protests and demonstrations were held through the country, and more than 13,000 people have been arrested since then. Opposition leaders currently staying in the country were also taken in by the police. Last week, the opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was put on the wanted list shortly after a disputed August 9th election in the country. She had then fled to neighbouring Lithuania. And since she's met with political leaders across the European Union and called for President Alexander Lukashenko to leave power by 25th October or face intense protests. Now, for more on the developments in Belarus, Julia Chapman joins us live from Moscow. Welcome, Julia. Now, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, says that he has changed his approach in dealing with the protesters and has threatened that he will track down every protester. Tell us more about this recent crackdown and what it means for the protest movement.
Well, Alexander Lukashenko has really been ramping up the rhetoric against protesters in the last couple of weeks, and it comes as he's now faced some 8 to 10 weeks now of protests in the country that have been carrying on despite the fact that Lukashenko seems to be holding on to power. It hasn't stopped people from taking to the streets almost daily, particularly on Sundays, and Lukashenko says now that he is going to try to round them all up, although he says that is not a threat. But he has also suggested that some of the protesters could be conscripted into military service as well. So he really is showing no tolerance here, and that comes after some officials had suggested that police could use firearms against protesters, although we haven't yet seen that. Police have been meeting protesters with a very heavy hand every weekend when they gather in their biggest numbers on Sundays, and this past Sunday some tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Minsk. Around 280 of them were arrested, and many of them quite brutally so. And so these protesters are still continuing to take to the streets weekly, and it comes ahead of Sunday when there is a deadline, this ultimatum that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the opposition leader who is in exile in Lithuania, she has issued this deadline which she calls the People's Ultimatum for Alexander Lukashenko to step down. So it's very likely that there will be tens of thousands of protesters on the streets once again.
Right, just talking about the opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she has been put on the wanted list in the country, and she has called for President Lukashenko to step down by 25th October or face intense backlash. So what lies ahead in Belarus's political landscape?
Well, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is fighting this battle from outside of the Belarusian borders, and it's very difficult for her. As you mentioned, she has been meeting with a number of European leaders, giving her credibility on the world stage, much to the ire of President Alexander Lukashenko, who has been losing legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of the world, although he has maintained his grip on power inside the country. And of course, he has the essential support of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has been backing him throughout the last couple of months of political turmoil in Belarus. Nevertheless, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya insists that she is the legitimate leader of Belarus. She believes that she won the August 9th presidential election, which the Central Election Commission gave to Alexander Lukashenko with more than 80% of the vote. But that result was disputed by Tikhanovskaya herself and the tens of thousands of protesters continuing to gather. So although there still remains huge opposition to Alexander Lukashenko's rule, so far it hasn't really made much of a dent in the day-to-day management of the country. Lukashenko inaugurated himself once again last month and still maintains his grip on power in the country.
Right. My final question, Julia, where does Russia stand in all this? Does Putin continue to support Lukashenko's methods?
He certainly does, and he has also met with Alexander Lukashenko here in Russia, and there was a very long discussion between the two leaders of Belarus and Russia. We'll probably never know exactly what they spoke about behind closed doors, but it allowed Lukashenko to come out of that meeting with the backing of the Russian president, and that is quite significant for him, at least in terms of controlling the security services, which he does still have support from, because, of course, that has been essential to his crackdown on protesters over the last couple of months. He has the support of the police and the security services in Belarus, which has allowed him to continue maintaining control over the country in the face of really unprecedented opposition. So Russian President Vladimir Putin issuing support for the Lukashenko regime in the face of this opposition has been quite significant for him, as it allows him to maintain legitimacy despite the fact that a growing number of countries has stopped recognizing Lukashenko as the rightful leader of Belarus.
Right. All right, Julia, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast, and thank you for all your inputs on this news development.